All right, Apex triggers. In Apex trigger, we're going to talk about the types of triggers. We're going to talk about context variables. Let's start off with a business requirement that might exist. So here we have this situation when candidate records are being saved to the database. Before we save those candidates to the database, if they don't have a legacy employee number, in other words, a value for a legacy employee number field, then let's default that value to 0. Okay? So theoretically, we could do this with a workflow rule, but it's the kind of thing that we could solve with a trigger. All right, so what is a trigger? So a trigger is merely think of it as a procedure that's being called when the Salesforce application server detects that you are making a modification to a specific type of object. And there are many different types of events that we're able to detect. You can create triggers on any custom or top-level standard object. There's certain objects you can't associate triggers with. So for instance, junction objects or something like we have our sharing tables, which determines access to records. You can't create triggers on those. So for the most part, it's those kind of behind-the-scenes tables that you can't create them on. But you can on most of the standard objects that you're going to care about. Use when you need to have some logic execute anytime before or after that record's being written to the database. Triggers are universal in the sense that it doesn't matter whether you're using the API or whether you're using the browser. Anytime that modification occurs to that to those records, they will fire off those triggers. So it doesn't matter the mechanism by which that is happening. So if we take a look here at the flow of what might occur in a trigger, so here the user is editing existing candidate record, and they're going to click on the Save button, and what's going to happen is that's going to then attempt to write that record to the database. What's going to happen is Salesforce is going to detect that if there are triggers associated with the update event. The trigger is going to be able to access that data in a special system variable called trigger.new. Trigger.new represents the records which are about to be written to the database. The trigger is also able, in this case this is an update, we can access the records that are the existing version of the record. So right now, in a trigger, we're intercepting the record, this new version of the record, as it's about to be written to the database. So we have this concept of trigger.new, which is the new copy, and we have trigger.old, which is the previous copy, which is about to be overwritten. We have access, in the case of an update, we have access to both. One of the key things that people do with trigger.new and trigger.old is to do a comparison. So your logic might be to check to see how something has changed at some point. And then one of the other things that people do with trigger.new specifically is they'll often want to modify it, like in our case where you're going to populate that legacy candidate number with the default value. So we could do that. Any changes that we make to trigger.new, we then will be able to modify those records, and then finally they'll be written to the database and ultimately committed, assuming everything works just fine. All right, there are two types of events that we have. There are before triggers and there are after triggers, or I should say there are before events and after events. When a trigger executes in the before mode, it's referring to before the record is written to the database. And what we're able to do here is we're able to say, all right, I'm going to, in a before context, modify the record before it's written to the database. So it gives you the ability to access and change that record. The after trigger is after the record has been written to the database. The key advantage of an after trigger is that if you think about something like an insert, because it's now been written to the database, we have access to the newly generated ID. So if we were going to create some child records and associate them with this particular record, we would need to do that within an after insert trigger, because only there do we have access to those IDs. There's also other system fields that are set by the database. So things like your last modified by, fields associated with formula fields, stuff like that. Okay? Let's take a look at the 17-step process. Starting at the very top, if we are either doing an insert or an update, if it's an insert, we're going to be initializing a record. If it's an update, we're going to be fetching the previous version. What we're going to do is in trigger.old, we're going to take the previous version and use that for trigger.old. And then in trigger.new, our list of records, we're going to take the new values, but also take the old version of the records and take the new values of the fields and overwrite the old versions. Now my point about explaining that is that let's say I go into a position and I'm only going to change the value of the name field. If I just do, okay, I'm going to select the position from the database, and then my next line of code, I'm going to modify the name, and then I do an update. In a trigger, when I access trigger.new, it does not just give me the name field. It gives me the new value for the name field and all of the other fields. So it is a representation of what the record is going to be once it is written to the database. Okay, a full copy of what it will look like. We execute some system validation rules, so things like required fields. We're going to do data type checking, that kind of stuff. Then we're going to execute our before triggers. So we're going to execute the before triggers. We are going to do that logic. Then we are going to run verify that you didn't, for instance, null out any required fields or anything along those lines. And we're also going to run your validation rules. So if you created custom validation rules, we're going to execute those at step 4. Another thing to point out is in between step 3 and 4, you might, in your before trigger, make sure that your data is passing some sort of validation rule. So it might be you're almost using the validation rule as almost an assertion in that case. In step 5, what you're going to do is you're going to save, or we're going to save those records to the database. So they are written to the database, but not yet committed. Okay? Then we are going to execute our after triggers. Now we have access to system-generated fields. Okay? Then we execute a bunch of different rules. So we execute things like assignment rules, auto-response rules, workflow rules. Our workflow rules might perform a field update. And if they do a field update and our triggers are set to fire when a record is updated, we will execute the before update if it exists and the after update if it exists. Now it doesn't mean we start over on step 3. We simply re-execute the triggers and then we continue on to step 12. We're going to execute our escalation rules. We're then going to do some calculations on roll-up summary fields or cross-object workflow for master detail relationships. Repeat the same process for grandparent records, which are doing the roll-up summaries. We're going to evaluate criteria-based sharing rules to possibly share the records with folks. And then finally, we're going to do step 16, which is the commit. So one of the things we'll talk about in a bit is we can actually, much like a validation rule, prevent a record from being written to the database. And the difference between writing the record to the database and committing it to the database is that when we write the record to the database, it's essentially in a temporary holding place. We're going to continue to do some business logic. One of that pieces of business logic might be to prevent, maybe we discover that the record, we have some validation logic in our trigger, in our after update trigger. We could then say, all right, don't commit that. I realize this record was written to the database, but don't commit it to the database. Okay? And that will then prevent step 16 from happening, and 16 is where we say, okay, any changes that we did to this record because of triggers, workflow rules, or roll-up summaries to other records, whatever the case may be, now let's apply those to the database. So the difference between the writing of the record to the database versus the commit is the point where you then say, okay, everything succeeded. All these things that I'm doing, of which writing the record to the database was one of them. Now we're going to do the commit, and now all these things will occur. And then finally, there's post-commit logic, and so you can think of this as things like sending out email alerts, outbound messages, stuff like that, which is more asynchronous in terms of the way that it executes. Okay. The other thing I want to point out, we talked about governors, but let's take a situation where we have a trigger, and a trigger can fire on a before update and an after update. In this case, if I have, let's say I have 26 SOQL queries. I'm going to burn through 26 SOQL queries on step 3. I'm going to burn through 26 more, total of 52 on step 6. Now if I have a field update occurring, I'm going to burn through another 26, which puts me up to 78, and then when I attempt to execute the after trigger for a second time, I'm going to then get up to 104. Okay? So we'll talk about sort of some design patterns, but you need to be aware that your triggers, when you set them up, can be running multiple times. And we can actually set flags in order to check the state of what we've already done in order to prevent those types of situations. Okay? All right. Cascading triggers. The thing here is that if you have something like that roll-up summary, so if I have a roll-up summary field on a child, on a detail record, and it's now going to recalculate something, if it modifies that parent record, now I'm going to execute any triggers associated with the parent object, right? So be careful about the fact that your triggers don't run alone, right? They run in the context of other things, especially when you're using features like roll-up summaries and so on, okay? Just a little reminder that your triggers run in without sharing. You cannot apply either of those keywords to the trigger, but if you do want to run in with sharing mode, simply create a class, apply with sharing to the class, and then call the method in that class. Anytime you have an unhandled exception, so if we just have an exception that we're not catching, then that's going to roll back the entire thing. Now that's different than explicitly preventing a specific record from being written to the database.